Good evening, everyone. What is Western civilization and why is it relevant? The idea of Western civilization or a common Western culture is enigmatic. David Gress, in From Plato to NATO, distinguishes between the Old West, that of Western European Christendom, a synthesis of Greek thought mediated through Rome, Christianity, and Germanic culture, and the New West, a synthesis of ideas built upon the foundations of Christendom that emerged in the Enlightenment: liberty or democracy, capitalism or prosperity, and rationality or science. In what has been called the grand narrative, the history of the West was portrayed as a sweeping development of the ideas of modern liberalism, culminating in the dominance of the United States and Western Europe in the post-World War II era. In our era, we see the grand narrative disintegrating, partly because, as Gress argues, the narrative itself was ahistorical and failed to see ideas in the context of the people who lived them, experienced them, and developed them. It is also true that Western culture is, as critics point out, disintegrating. Christopher Dawson, the eminent British historian, argued that in spite of the religious disunion of the European people in the Reformation era, there was still a European cultural unity lasting into the modern era based on a common allegiance to the classic tradition and the common embracing of the principles of rationality and humanism. However, that consensus no longer holds. Reason has not been able to establish the hoped-for principles of truth, justice, and prosperity. Dawson argued that was because there was a deeper need within the human heart for a spiritual or at least a moral unity, a set of shared values and principles by which one could live. Exactly where that might originate, he was not sure, but for Dawson, the roots of and hope of the West were found in its Christian heritage and recapturing it. Is Western culture relevant? That's a difficult question. As a Christian, I am committed to a worldview that transcends geography or cultural history, whether Western or Eastern, American or otherwise. As an Orthodox Christian, one whose spiritual roots are connected historically to, but yet distinct from, the Western Christian tradition, this student sees an eternal relevance in the gospel, in the shared Christian tradition and experience that can powerfully form the sense of meaning and purpose in a culture. Is Western civilization Christian any longer? All cultures have some sort of binding framework that helps establish meaning and purpose in the life of the people. In the West, however, that tradition has become fragmented in a multitude of pieces. The Reformation principle of sola scriptura, which leaves each individual person responsible for determining the truth from Scripture for themselves, leads to an atomization of society and, according to Brad S. Gregory, had the unintended consequence of the secularization of society. Because religion incites passion, it was banished from the public square and becomes a matter of private opinion, relevant for the individual, but not necessarily relevant to the culture. When the culture of the West as a whole moves away from even a private Christian consensus, or for that matter any religious consensus, that it is difficult to see what can hold the society together. For Western civilization to endure, there will have to be a renewal of some sort of vision for meeting the spiritual needs of people, or at least a set of moral principles which can give a shared conception of truth, beauty, and the good. The other aspect of Gress's typology, the New West, includes the synthesis of rationality, liberty, and prosperity, or reason, democracy, and capitalism. These values are threatened in modern culture. We still pay lip service to the reality of scientific knowledge, as the discussions about COVID show. But postmodern ideology denies any belief in the existence of rationality and truth and stands at the abyss of nihilism. If truth is determined ultimately by each individual, then the most powerful will inevitably control the definition of reality. Might makes right, which leads to totalitarianism, either mild or deadly. Democracy, political liberty, is a messy system. The majority can vote to impose injustice or the Islamic law under the Taliban. But democracy leaves open the possibility, the opportunity for the expression of individual creativity and provides a check on absolute power. Reinhold Niebuhr said, "Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary." Capitalism is also a messy system with its capacity to stimulate and reward greed and cruelty. Yet without private property, there is no freedom. Without entrepreneurship, there is no development of new products, technologies, medicines that can raise the standard of living for all. So the ideas of what is put forward as Western civilization retain relevance. The gospel of Christ, a spiritual and moral foundation built on a common tradition, the institutions of democracy, scientific rationality, and economic freedom, whether they will devolve completely into nihilism, rationalism, license, self-gratification, and exploitation, or whether we will be able to pull back from the edge of the abyss, remains to be seen. Thank you for paying attention and listening to my presentation.